Today we're going to talk about Her Royal Highness Queen Elizabeth II. She's the longest reigning monarch in the world. She is the living embodiment of history. I want to thank Amanda Taylor, the director of the Concordia Parish Public Library, and her staff, and Delta Bank for sponsoring this program and making it available to all of you. This is just one in a series that we've enjoyed doing, and we look forward to doing others in the future. Elizabeth II, the royal family. There's mixed feelings about them, frankly, even in Britain, in her own home country. Some people feel that they're all an anachronism. The whole concept of the monarchy and the king and the queen and the princesses and dukes and duchesses and all of that, that's just old news that really ought to be done away with. And yet, it's those kings and queens and princes and princesses and dukes and duchesses that bring in a boatload of money to Britain every year. Tourists love to go look. And what are they looking at? They're looking at living history. And that's what Elizabeth II is. This year is a remarkable year for her and for all of us. She's celebrating what's known as her Platinum Jubilee. That means that she has served without a break for 70 years as the Queen of Britain and the Commonwealth and all the rest of it. And because of that very special celebration, then a fellow named Matthew Dennison decided to take advantage of the situation, and he wrote this wonderful book. It's called The Queen. He published it in September of last year, September 2021. He's quite an interesting guy. He's a very private man. I could not find any place that certified exactly where he was born and when he was born. So we just have to look at his photograph and try to figure out for ourselves. We do know that he studied English at Christ Church in Oxford. He studied history of the decorative arts at the University of Glasgow. He works as a journalist, an historian, a broadcaster, and an author. So he's a very creative type. He is married, he has one child, and we know that he's living in England. Beyond that, there's nothing available on Mr. Dennison. His first biography was entitled The Last Princess, The Devoted Life of Queen Victoria's Youngest Daughter, and that he published in 2007. His latest is this one, which is his 9th biography, and it takes a look at the 7 decades that Queen Elizabeth has been on the throne, but it does something else. It goes back before she goes on the throne. It goes back to her childhood, a childhood that was relatively free of care except for the one little problem called World War II, which affected Britain and all the rest of us. But it also shows her as the child who is not the heir apparent. No one thought that she would ever be queen, and so she had a kind of happy childhood, unfettered childhood, that had she been the heir apparent that early would have been entirely different, and I think she would have been different as a result. Dennison has done a remarkable job in capturing Elizabeth and capturing the people around her. Philip, for example, her beloved prince. We learn more about Philip in this book, I think, than we're going to learn in any other single place. His biographies have all been well received. He's done one about Beatrix Potter, for example, which is quite good. And he's done another one that deals with Queen Victoria herself. He's also dabbled in science fiction. So Dennison is the fellow you need to pay attention to when you're looking for something a little different to read. Back to the Queen, though. The reason I selected it as the book to basically base this discussion on this morning was because it is the finest historical record of the monarch's life anywhere. You'll find bits and pieces in different publications, and quite a few in some of the tabloids, which you probably are interested in, but doesn't necessarily connect to her real history. But if you want to know her life, her attitudes, and her devotion to her people, then The Queen is the book for you. The Daily Telegraph in Britain, the writer there who was reviewing The Queen wrote this: anyone who wants a rapid, lucid, well-organized dash through the Queen's 7 decades on the throne could do no better. And I would agree. You know, Britain has watched her grow up. There are few now left in Britain alive who remember her as a child, but there are many left in Britain who remember her as a young queen. Today, she is sort of everyone's grandmother. She's the one who looks and seems approachable, although in many ways she's not. She's very strict on her royal protocol. However, she's the one who's responsible for breaking protocol at a most important time in British history, according to the monarch's rules of decorum and where they're supposed to behave, how they're supposed to behave. And we'll talk about that in a little while. In The Queen, when Denison introduces his book, he says this: Elizabeth II's life story is not a fairy tale. I'm going to stop here for a minute. So many of us, especially we girls, grew up with the concept of Cinderella who marries the prince and lives happily ever after and all that stuff. And we think in terms of kings and queens having an inordinately wonderful life. That is until we look at history. When we look at history and we find out that some have been beheaded and others have fallen into a form of disgrace never to rise from again, you realize that these monarchs are living life, and no one's life is a fairy tale. Denison continues, royal rhetoric in Elizabeth's lifetime has celebrated the idea of a reigning family of ordinary people in extraordinary positions. In 1982, Elizabeth II told housewives in Sheffield that she too found it difficult to keep her floors clean. In 1990, she requested that a designer shorten the neckline of her coat because she's so short. And in 2000, she told viewers during her Christmas broadcast, which she gives every year, that, quote, the framework in which I try to lead my life is one available to many millions, Christ's teachings. This was a surprise to me. I have a tendency to think of England and Europe as being far more secular than religious. And in truth, that is the prevailing wave. What's interesting is Elizabeth is not. Elizabeth II is a very religious woman, and she lives her life according to, and makes her decisions according to Christ's teachings. It's a very, very interesting anomaly, I should say. The Reading Evening Post in February 1991, the editor there wrote this: we do not want the Queen to be one of us, but we do want her to be with us. And therein lies the rub. To be the Queen is to be set apart, to be different, to be regal, to be royal, to be special. But to be the Queen for the people, she has to be accessible, believable. She must garner not only the respect of a monarch, but the love of her people for another human being. Margaret Rhodes is Queen Elizabeth's cousin. In 2015, when she was being interviewed about the Queen, she remembered that when Elizabeth was 21 years old, she is a princess at that point. Even that young, she dedicated her life to the service of her people. And what made this unusual was, one, she's very young to be thinking in such serious terms, but it also was unusual because she was already setting in place what would be the groundwork for her future reign, and that would be always and first to serve the people. And her cousin, Margaret Rhodes, said this: "It was an incredible thing to envision a whole life ahead of you where your own choices are not followed, where you know what you are going to be doing every day of the week for months ahead, and where spontaneity goes out the window." In April 29th, as a matter of fact, 1929, Princess Elizabeth, who was nicknamed Lilibet, appeared on the cover of Time magazine. And you can see here, she is contemplative, but she's also a little bit chubby. She looks like everybody's child, and it was a wonderful way to introduce the new princess to the public. She is not an heir apparent at this point. She's just down the line somewhere. She's just a princess. April 21st of 1926, Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary was born to Prince Albert, who was the Duke of York, and Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. She was their firstborn. She was delivered by cesarean section, and later she would be joined by a young sister named Margaret. The nickname Lilibet is probably going to ring a bell with those of you who do pay attention to royal comings and goings. That's the name of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's daughter. And they named her Lilibet on purpose as a way to honor Queen Elizabeth. The first 10 years of Elizabeth's life, she had all of the privileges of being a member of the royal family, but none of the pressures that would fall on an heir apparent. The family lived a relatively normal life. They spent their time, part of it in London, in their home, which was in London, it wasn't at the palace, and at the Royal Lodge, which is the family home on the grounds of Windsor Great Park, which we think of as Windsor Castle in its environment. The two little girls were tutored at home. This was typical for royal family children. They took courses in French, mathematics, history, dance, singing, and art. Dennison points out in his book that theirs was a typical education for royal children at the time, unless they were heir apparents. And at this point, she's not. So she doesn't get the extra history, the extra government operations, those kinds of things that she would have had if she had been born as the heir apparent. I love this picture. It shows Princess Elizabeth standing in front of a playhouse. Now, when we think of playhouses, they're slightly smaller than this one and perhaps not quite so grand. This is a Welsh cottage with the thatched roof to it. And it was, in fact, a gift given by the people of Wales in 1931 to Margaret and to Elizabeth. And they loved it. They especially loved it because it gave them a place to play that wasn't inside the palace. There were people, of course, making sure that they were safe, as is exactly what one would do. But they aren't just breathing over their shoulders. So they spent many happy hours playing house in the little cottage. The greatest tremor that ran through Britain and the Commonwealth in the early days of Elizabeth's life was the abdication of her uncle when he stepped down from being the king. This meant, in the blink of an eye, Elizabeth's father becomes king, a role he never wanted and was never particularly comfortable with. and Elizabeth becomes the heir apparent. She will follow her father. This is the way it went. January 1936, King George V dies, and Elizabeth's Uncle David becomes King Edward VIII. That would have been okay, except Edward was much more interested in his personal life than he had ever been with the potential life as a king, which he had grown up knowing that one day he would be. He had fallen in love with an American divorcee, and he was having a rather robust affair with her at the time. And he assumed, okay, I'm the king, I'll marry her, which was certainly just fun with her. Just 12 months later, from January to December of 1936, Edward abdicates, and Elizabeth's daddy becomes King George VI. Elizabeth becomes heir apparent, and literally overnight, her life is changed forever. I'll tell you something. The embarrassment of Edward's abdication still haunts the royal family. It doesn't help that 3 of the Queen's children are divorced. It doesn't matter or doesn't help that several of her children have led lives that were less than following a sense of duty and royal decorum. That whole situation made a profound difference in the way Elizabeth viewed life. For one, she realized life can change in a heartbeat. For another, she learned that things happen that are beyond our control. And third, she learned that we must stand above the fray in order to perform our duty to our people. This is a picture of Margaret and Elizabeth, and they're about to do a radio broadcast. When World War II began in 1939, the girls moved to Windsor Castle. It was considered much safer than London for obvious reasons. In 1940, the following year, Princess Elizabeth was 14 years old, and she delivered the first of what would be several broadcasts across radio that were designed to reassure the British children during wartime. It was recorded for the BBC's Children's Hour, and they did the recording right there at Windsor. On October 13th, 1940, Princess Elizabeth gave her first radio address, and I'm going to quote from her the ending of that address. There's a certain charm to it. Remember, she's 14. Before I finish, I can truthfully say to you all that we children at home are full of cheerfulness and courage. We are trying to do all we can to help our gallant sailors, soldiers, and airmen. And we are trying too to bear our own share of the danger and sadness of war. We know, every one of us, that in the end, all will be well, for God will care for us and give us victory and peace. And when peace comes, remember it will be for us, the children of today, to make the world of tomorrow a better and happier place. My sister is by my side, and we are both going to say good night to you. And then she turns to her sister and she says, say good night, Margaret. And Margaret says, good night. It's really quite charming. One of the things that a lot of people don't know about the princess is that in 1945, she actually began serving in the women's branch of the British Army. She's 19 and she joins the Auxiliary Territorial Service, which is strictly a group for women. In that volunteer placement, she trained right alongside other British volunteer women. She learned there to become an expert driver, and she still insists on driving her Land Rover herself today. She also learned to be an expert mechanic. She didn't do this for all that long, but it gave her a taste of what it would be like to live in a non-royal world. This was closer to it than she'd had as a child. As a child, she was still a princess and she was still, sort of cared for. This time, though, she's out with her sleeves rolled up and she's learning and she's working and she's helping alongside ordinary women who gave her great insight to the British spirit and the British way of thinking. On May 8th, 1945, it was Victory in Europe Day, and it was quite a wonderful day. As you can see from this picture, the crowds just stormed Buckingham Palace. And of course, Margaret and Elizabeth wanted to celebrate with them. The king decided with great hesitation that he would let them go, but they had to be in disguise. And so they wore disguises and went out into the crowd, and they celebrated the war's end with all the other people. Elizabeth chose to wear her auxiliary transport service uniform because a lot of other women would have on exactly the same thing. We don't know what Margaret wore. That apparently is lost in time. In Elizabeth's diary the next morning, when she finally got back into the palace, she wrote, "Trafalgar Square, Piccadilly, Pall Mall, walked simply miles." In 1985, Elizabeth, the Queen, was asked in a BBC interview, "How did you really get out like that?" And she said it was easy. "I pulled my uniform cap well down over my eyes and I wasn't spotted in the crowd." Princess Elizabeth fell in love quite young. In fact, she was 13 at the time. She met Philip Mountbatten, son of Prince Andrew of Greece, who was 18 in 1934. He was a distant cousin of hers, and he had ties to both the Danish royal families and the Greek royal families, so he had an aristocratic bloodline. She never forgot him, and she began a campaign of letters with him as she grew up, and she's literally growing up from a 13-year-old and writing this 5-year-older man. Her father, the king, initially discouraged his daughter because Philip had a reputation of being, quote, rather rough, close quote. He was. It was part of his great charm. Philip always had a way of doing things exactly right according to the decorum, but also managing to get in a bit of an aside occasionally that would not necessarily pass muster, but it always did with the Queen. She loved it. He had a delicious sense of humor. While she was growing up, he, at 5 years older, he's working on his naval career. That's exactly what he expected to spend his life doing. In fact, during World War II, he saw action. He was a midshipman on the battleship HMS Valiant. George VI was really very reluctant to approve of what was obviously a growing romance. But Elizabeth turned out to be just as strong-willed as her father, and she won the day. And so the romance continued, and ultimately they became engaged. Shortly before the engagement was announced, Philip gave Elizabeth an engagement ring, and it was made from diamonds that he had taken from his late mother's tiara, and a 3-carat diamond solitaire centers it. You see a picture of it here along with their engagement picture. Today, even as a widow, if you look closely at some of the still photographs of Queen Elizabeth, you'll see that ring still in place. The two became officially engaged in July of 1947, and the king said, "Okay, that's fine, but you'll have to get married next year, probably June or July." They got married in November of that year because Princess Elizabeth said no. She had waited all this time for the prince, and she was now ready to marry him. What was interesting, because of the war, there was rationing. And so things were not as readily available. And so the princess collected cloth ration coupons just like other brides of the same period. This is their wedding portrait. They were married in Westminster Abbey in front of 2,000 invited guests on November the 20th, 1947. The tiara that she's wearing is known as Queen Mary's fringed tiara, and it broke just as she was leaving the palace to go to Westminster to be married. So the royal jeweler had to be called in an emergency to put it back together. And he did, and so all was well. But it was that first little blip in what was otherwise a perfect day. The British government issued her 200 extra ration coupons to try to help with the dress. But what was especially sweet were many of her subjects throughout the kingdom sent her their ration cards. That was against the law, however. Each was returned with a sweet personal note of thanks. The theme for the wedding was the rebirth and growth after World War II of the land. Her gown and the veil were embroidered with emblems of wheat roses and star-shaped flowers that were executed in threads of gold and silver. One anomaly to it, on the left side of her wedding gown, on the skirt, there's a 4-leaf clover that's embroidered, and it was placed there so that Elizabeth's hand would rest upon it during the ceremony to give her luck. There are over 10,000 seed pearls, crystals, and sequins hand sewn onto that gown. It took 350 women 7 weeks to make. Even so, the star at the reception was her wedding cake. It was 9 feet tall, weighed 500 pounds. The reception at Buckingham Palace literally revolved around this gorgeous cake. According to British custom, it was a fruit cake, and it was made from dried fruit that had come from Australia, and it was preserved with rum and brandy from South Africa, and because of that, it was nicknamed the 10,000-mile wedding cake. Baked in the bottom tier, the largest tier of all, according again to British custom, were a series of silver pieces. There was a coin, which meant wealth and good luck. A bell, if you got that piece, meant you were going to get married. A button, you were going to be a permanent bachelor. A ring, marriage. A thimble, permanent spinster. A horseshoe, good luck. And boot, lots of travel. One tier they saved for the christening for their hoped-for firstborn son, who would be the heir apparent. One tier was sent to Australia as a thank you to that country because every girl in the Australian Girl Guides Association had contributed to the cost of the ingredients for that cake. Elizabeth and Margaret were both Girl Guides, and so this was a special love of hers. And a slice was sent to Nigeria to the Girl Guides at the ITU leprosy settlement in Nigeria. That's a UK-based charity, Lepra, for lepers. The marriage began well, and the marriage stayed well. Just a few weeks after the marriage, Elizabeth wrote this to her parents in a letter. "We behave as though we had belonged to each other for years. Philip is an angel. He is so kind and thoughtful." At the same time, Philip wrote a letter to his new mother-in-law, in which he said, "My ambition is to weld the two of us into a new combined existence that will not only be able to withstand the shocks directed at us, but will also have a positive existence for the good." 1949 to 1951 were very special years for Philip and Elizabeth. Their first children are born, but they also have time to live almost ordinary lives. Philip was commander of a Royal Navy ship, and he was advancing right on with his military career. And the couple lived several months at a time in Malta, where Elizabeth experienced ordinary life as an officer's wife. She would drive a Jeep to go to the grocery store. She'd buy groceries. She would prepare meals. She was a wife, an ordinary wife. The rest of the time, they did have to be in London, so they resided at Clarence House. The children remained in Britain when they were in Malta. And there's been quite a lot of discussion about that, including Dennison in his book, about the effect that that had on the children, particularly Prince Charles. He was the heir apparent, he's the oldest, and he's just a toddler, and he's left for long periods of time. Charles was born in 1948, Anne was born in 1950, and then they're going to go on and have two other children later. All of this was going to change, of course. Elizabeth was aware that her father was in poor health, but no one really expected him to die when he did. This is a picture called the Treetops Room. It's in Kenya at a beautiful refuge. And this is the place, the room, where the royal couple stayed on the night that her father passed away. You'll see pictures of this, often with the caption, "The room, the stairs where a princess went up to bed and came down a queen." Princess Elizabeth and Philip had agreed to take a tour of Australia and New Zealand in her father's place in deference to his fragile health. The first stop was going to be Kenya. On February 6th, he died, and it was given to Philip the chore of telling Elizabeth that her father was gone. Dennison does a really fine job in the book talking about this brief moment. He describes them going out into the back. The British word for a backyard is garden, and he describes they go out into the garden and they pace side by side, up and down, for nearly half an hour. And you know, at that time, they are trying to assimilate the news and recognize the enormous change that has just happened. They immediately returned to the United Kingdom and very quickly moved into Buckingham Palace. Queen Mary, Elizabeth's grandmother, had been actually in poorer health than Elizabeth's father. But she too died in March of 53, and according to her wishes, Elizabeth's coronation was to go ahead as planned, no extended mourning period, which would have been the norm at the time. Preparing for a coronation takes about a year. It's a big deal. Doesn't mean that the person isn't the queen. She is. She has duties that she has to perform, but the actual coronation is a little bit later. So we have Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, officially Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of her other realms and territories, Queen, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith. And so she has been since 1953. Queen Elizabeth's coronation was something to behold. It was in 1953. This is the official coronation portrait, and it is a beautiful picture, I think. You see her, she has The youthful look, she is very young, but she also has a serious look. So you can tell from the expression on her face, she's really not taking this lightly. I want to take you through the portrait to look for a moment at three particular objects that are central to the coronation. The first is the imperial state crown. The imperial crown is particularly beautiful. It was created in 1937 and it's been used ever since. It contains 2,868 diamonds, 17 sapphires, 11 emeralds, 269 pearls, and 4 rubies. This is the crown that the monarch wears when he or she leaves Westminster Abbey after the coronation. This is not the coronation crown. They're two distinctly different crowns. The coronation crown is solid gold. It weighs 5 pounds, and it is extraordinarily difficult and heavy to balance on the head. So they do the coronation with the gold crown, but then they use the crown that you see here for all of the other events that the queen or king will be involved in that are at the state level. It's used on formal occasions, most notably when the queen opens Parliament. By the way, you see there's a large red stone right at the center, the top of the crown. It's not a ruby, it's a semi-precious stone. Now look at the sovereign scepter. It's a beautiful thing. This thing was first used in 1661 and has been used at every coronation since. In 1910, the Cullinan 1 diamond was placed on it. It's the largest top quality cut white diamond in the world, and it weighs 530.2 carats. And then the orb. This also has been used since 1661. The cross above the globe represents Christ's dominion over the world, as monarch is God's representative on earth. It's a hollow sphere. It's gold, but it's not as heavy as it looks like it would be. It has 9 emeralds, 18 rubies, 9 sapphires, 365 diamonds, 374 pearls, 1 amethyst, and 1 glass stone. I have looked everywhere to find why there is 1 glass stone in the middle of all these precious gems. I can't find it. I invite you to contact the Concordia Parish Public Library if you find out, because I want to know. The pearls divide the orb into 3 sections, representing the 3 continents that in 1661 the people believed existed, and that would have been the realm of the monarch. This picture is delightful. You see a very happy Elizabeth. She's riding to her coronation with Philip in the gold state coach. You gotta hand it to the Brits. When they gussy it up, they gussy it up right. This coronation was the first one ever televised. And so 27 million people in the United Kingdom watched her. The ceremony was 3 hours. It took place in Westminster Abbey. Prince Charles was able to attend and see his mother crowned, and he was the first child of a sovereign to ever be able to do that. The procession from the Abbey back to Buckingham Palace was witnessed in person by 3 million people along the route, including this one. You may recognize her. She was at the time a journalist for the Washington Times-Herald, and she was known at that time as Jacqueline Bouvier. Later, Jackie Kennedy. She covered the coronation. That gold state coach is something else. It was commissioned in 1760 by King George III. It weighs 4 tons, and it requires 8 Windsor Gray Stallions to pull it. It has been used for every coronation since King George IV in 1821. This map shows you in the dark blue all of the countries that Queen Elizabeth II has visited to date. She was committed at the outset of her reign to preserving the British Commonwealth, and she began her reign by making plans on how to do it. World War I and then World War II had created such worldwide disruption that there was danger of members of the Commonwealth pulling away. She was determined to see that that not happen. She also believed in being seen among the people, and she's responsible for some major changes in the way royals interacted with people. During her reign, she has visited 110 countries across 6 continents. She is the most traveled monarch in the world. The thing I mentioned earlier that she did that was a first, that is now considered ordinary and everyday, but was a radical departure from royal decorum, she and Prince Philip began the walkabout, where they would come down the streets, fans lining either side of the street, and they would walk about and meet those people and speak with them. And of course, often the children especially would give the Queen flowers. And it was the first time it had ever been done. They did it in 1970 on a tour of Australia and New Zealand, and it was quite popular with the people. Here are a couple of other pictures. You've got Queen Elizabeth in Berlin as she's meeting some of her fans in Germany, and then in Australia you see the Duke of Edinburgh, and he is obviously talking to the children and having a great time. Today we see royal family members walk about all the time. It was not done before Elizabeth. I think the thing that impressed me the most about Denison's book was the historical scope of Elizabeth's reign. She has met personally 13 sitting U.S. presidents. Lyndon Johnson's the only one that she missed. It began in 1951 with President Truman, 57, President Eisenhower, and again in 59 with President Eisenhower, 61, President Kennedy, 69, President Nixon, 76, President Ford, 77, President Carter, 82, President Reagan, 91, President George Bush, 95, President Clinton, 2003, President George W. Bush, 2009, President Obama, 2015, President Trump, 2021, President Biden. Think about that in your sense of American history and time passing. And she's been queen through all of those. She especially enjoyed meeting with President Dwight Eisenhower. Obviously, his role as the Allied commander in World War II and his work closely with Churchill to preserve Britain made him a special person to her. This is a photograph of the two of them taken at a state banquet honoring her at the White House. It was in 1957. If you'll notice, Eisenhower is wearing the British Order of Merit that King George VI, her father, awarded him right after World War II. So he wore that to honor her and her father. This is a picture from '61. It shows a very young John Kennedy and a very young Jackie Kennedy meeting at Buckingham Palace for a beautiful banquet that was held for them. This one, though, is my favorite. You can see the Queen is reading from her notes, obviously delivering a speech, and President Reagan has lost it. It's a major laugh. It's at an official state dinner honoring the Queen and Prince Philip that was hosted by President and Mrs. Reagan in California, San Francisco, at a museum there in 1983. The laughter is because Reagan kept telling her she must come to sunny California. It was the most beautiful, sunshine-filled state of all the United States, and she must come and ride horseback with him at his ranch. When she arrived, she and the prince, it was raining cats and dogs. They couldn't go to the ranch. It was all just miserable. And so that night, with a perfectly straight face, she is thanking President Reagan for the lovely, sunshiny weather that she and the prince have enjoyed while in California. They were friends. They were not just president and monarch. They, Reagan and Elizabeth II, became friends. They had some very interesting things in common. One, both deeply religious. Two, both horse nuts. They loved horses, and they loved horseback riding, and they loved horse racing. She invited him to Windsor Castle on the grounds of Windsor Great Park to ride horseback with her. And they rode for a considerable amount of time. Denison documents it. And they rode having a conversation. And it's the kind of completely natural, relaxed conversation neither one of them probably had that much opportunity to have. And it really did cement their friendship. That deep love of horses, plus their mutual respect, made it go beyond what would be considered the formal relationship between two heads of state. When he was at Windsor, Reagan said that her horses were among the finest that he had ever seen. And that, of course, was what she wanted to hear. Many people don't realize Elizabeth II has a wonderful stable of racehorses in which she takes great pride. In 1989, Elizabeth II granted Reagan an honorary knighthood. It's the highest distinction the UK awards to foreigners. And she did that specifically because of Reagan's help during the Falkland Wars. Another way that you look at the breadth of time that this woman has served is look at the prime ministers that she served with. There were 14. Every week she meets in person until COVID, when it became by Zoom. She meets with the prime minister, and he comes to her and he explains to her what's going on with the government. She listens and she makes comments. The Queen never interferes with governmental affairs. She is never political, but she, in this private time, can express an opinion, which is never divulged by the Prime Minister and it's never divulged by the Queen. She began this in 1953 when she became Queen, and her Prime Minister was Winston Churchill. From there, from 1953 to the present, she's gone through 14 of them. Anthony Eden, Harold Macmillan, Alec Douglas Home, Harold Wilson, Edward Heath, Harold Wilson again, James Callahan, Margaret Thatcher, John Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson. Once again, Denison is helping us to understand the breadth of history that this woman has lived through. Queen Elizabeth has said often that she enjoyed meeting with Churchill the most because Churchill's meetings were always such fun. Prime Minister Thatcher was an interesting challenge for Elizabeth. Thatcher's only 6 months older than Elizabeth, so she was the Prime Minister who was the closest to Elizabeth in age. In 1990, after Thatcher left her office, Queen Elizabeth awarded her Britain's highest honor, the Order of Merit, and granted her husband a baronetcy, making him Sir Dennis Thatcher. This is interesting because Denison makes a big point of talking about the conventional wisdom of the time. While Thatcher was the Iron Lady, she was the prime minister who handled the Falkland Wars and did all these things very well and very abruptly. He makes a big deal about the fact that the conventional wisdom was that the two women didn't get along. The truth is they got along very well, Elizabeth's only complaint about Margaret Thatcher, which Denison unearths, is that she said, the Prime Minister has no sense of humor. And what was funny about that was Elizabeth II has a very subtle but a robust sense of humor. Thatcher is quite literal. And so she doesn't see humor in a lot of things. One of the jokes that Denison tells is that Thatcher would often have to call up one of her friends and ask them to explain something that had happened on one of the British comedies because she didn't think it was funny. She didn't understand what made it so funny. The final evidence of how close the two women were was when Thatcher died, Queen Elizabeth broke royal protocol and attended her funeral out of respect. According to Denison, Queen Elizabeth very early in their marriage decided that since she was to be head of state, Philip was to be head of the house. And she lived her life with Philip in that way. She left all decisions concerning their children to Philip. The heir apparent, Prince Charles, was given the very finest education available based on his father's judgment. And his father insisted that he would go to the same Scottish boarding school that Prince Philip had gone to. Prince Philip had loved it. Prince Charles absolutely hated it. Charles was much more introspective, much more thoughtful, much more interested in the mystical. He, even today, is a student of world religions, even though he's going to become the defender of the faith in England and Britain. He's also extremely interested in other expressions of faith and other religions. So he was just different. Philip was just a man's man. He was a sailor. He loved the military. He didn't mind the Spartan existence at the boarding school. He was all into it, and it crushed Prince Charles. They had two other children. The third child, Andrew, was born at Buckingham Palace in 1960, and 4 years later, their fourth son, Edward, was also born at Buckingham Palace. This is a family portrait, which shows Elizabeth as the center of the family, as she should be. And you have the prince, and the prince, and the prince, and the prince, and the princess all around her. Philip the father, Charles the heir apparent, Andrew, Anne, and Edward. To say the children have not been, how shall I say it? To say that the children have not been the perfection that parents would hope is an understatement. Every single one of them, with the possible exception of the youngest, Edward, has been involved in something. Here you have a montage of pictures. You've got Prince Charles with his first wife. You have Andrew with his first wife. You have Anne with her first husband, all of them divorced and remarried. And then you have Edward with Sophie, and that's his current wife, his first wife, and it would appear his only wife. There's 2 second marriages in the family. Anne married a second time, and of course, Prince Charles married a second time. And we've only recently been told through a directive from Queen Elizabeth that it is her wish that Camilla Parker Bowles be named Queen Consort when Charles assumes the throne. What is a Platinum Jubilee? I told you at the beginning that it marks 70 years of a continuous reign by a monarch. Not very many of them make it. Queen Elizabeth II today holds the record for the longest reign of service as Britain's monarch. She's also the longest serving female head of state in all of history. and she's the first British royal in history to serve 70 continuous years. Jubilee. You need to know what this is. It has different connotations. Let me see if I can make it make some sense for you. Jubilees are first referred to in the Bible, actually, in the Old Testament. In that configuration, it means a 7-year period, and it was used as a land management tool to indicate that every 7 years land needed to be left unplanted for a year so it could recover before crops were put in again. Later on, Jubilees were considered to be any special year when they felt that God's blessings had been even greater than in a normal year. It was in 1300 AD, however, that the Roman Catholic Church began celebrating Jubilees in a formal fashion. These were years that were set aside for forgiveness and reconciliation with God. And today's Catholic Church celebrates Jubilee every 25 years. This portrait is from Elizabeth's Silver Jubilee, when she had been on the throne for 25 years. This was in 1977. It's a beautiful portrait. For that 25 years of service, there was a wonderful service at St. Paul's Cathedral. And during that service, she repeated the pledge that she had made at her coronation 25 years earlier, that she would devote her entire life to the service of her people. And you may remember that when she was 21, she made that same promise when she was yet a princess. She moved through the city of London in the state gold coach, the same one that she'd used for the coronation. This portrait from May 2001 marked her golden jubilee, when she had been on the throne for 50 years. And this one is a portrait that was specifically done to honor Canada. She again moves through the streets of London in the state gold coach. There's a service of thanksgiving for her 50 years of life as monarch at St. Paul's. And there's also a parade down the Thames and a concert outside of the grounds of Buckingham Palace. Then, 10 years later, there's her Diamond Jubilee. This is when she served 60 years on the throne. You see, they get a little closer together and they get a little bit more elaborate because she's living a long time, longer than most of the monarchs do. For her 60th, for her Diamond Jubilee, again, a service of thanksgiving at St. Paul's, another parade down the Thames, and a bigger concert outside Buckingham Palace. In 2017, when Philip was 96, he announced his retirement after 65 years of service to Crown and country. Both the Queen and Philip were out and about the Thursday after his retirement news was announced, and they were attending an event at St. James Palace in London. One of the attendees, a Sir Michael Atiyah, a mathematician, said to Philip, "I'm so sorry to hear you're standing down." To which Philip replied, "Well, I can't stand up much longer." And he laughed, and the others hearing it laughed as well. His record of service is phenomenal. He did, at the time of his retirement, he had completed 22,219 solo engagements, 637 solo overseas visits, 5,496 numbers of speeches, 785 patron organizations. He was the patron for these many organizations, and he had authored 14 books. The announcement of his death was posted on the Buckingham Palace gates. That's according to tradition. He died on April the 9th, 2021. The Queen announced the death of her beloved husband. The official announcement from the palace said that her prince had passed away at Windsor Castle that morning. Philip holds the record as the longest serving royal consort in British history. That afternoon of his death, Westminster Abbey began tolling its tenor bell once every 60 seconds, and it rang 99 times to honor the prince's 99 years of life. The flag at Buckingham was lowered to half-mast, and of course the notices went out. Floral tributes were placed outside the palace in London and at Windsor. And the day after his death, at exactly noon, a 41-gun salute took place, honoring the prince in London, Edinburgh, Cardiff, Belfast, Gibraltar, and at sea from Royal Navy warships. We haven't seen a funeral of this kind since Princess Diana's funeral. Prince Philip's was much more understated because it was occurring in the middle of a worldwide pandemic. And I think in many ways it was more poignant. For one thing, the Queen had to sit alone because of COVID. The other family members who were allowed to attend were in little family groups, couples or maybe three. And so there was a distance within the whole of the place. The funeral was held at Windsor Castle in St. George's Chapel. Jim and I have been there. It's just a gorgeous place. And it was very small. It had been planned to every detail, the music, the speakers, the procession, all of it, every detail determined by Philip himself. He was buried after the service in the Royal Vault in St. George's Chapel, which is the resting place for all of them. You see here Charles and Camilla seated alone at the service, and of course the Queen seated very much alone at the service. Many people who watched the funeral were fascinated by the hearse. It's a most interesting looking piece of machinery, and it was designed entirely by Philip to carry his casket. He started it in 2003, working with Land Rover to create a unique hearse to use for his own funeral. The open-top rear section was made to hold a wooden coffin, which was his, a very simple wooden coffin. A duplicate hearse had to be made as a backup, just in case on the day when he had to be moved from one place or another in this Land Rover hearse that he designed. If something happened to it, there would be one to quickly join in and take up. It's a hybrid electric vehicle. Philip was always ahead of his time in his thinking. He had it painted dark bronze green because he wanted it to look like the military Land Rovers. There were three sayings in World War II during the definitive years of Elizabeth's youth. One, your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory. Another, freedom is in peril, defend it with all your might. And the third, the most familiar to us, keep calm and carry on. Following the funeral, Elizabeth II has done that. That slogan originated from World War II posters. May 11th, just a month after her husband's death, Queen Elizabeth read the Queen's speech seated on the sovereign's throne in the House of Lords to open Parliament. COVID restrictions meant that she had more of a mourning period than would normally have occurred because she did not want to mourn. She wanted to get out and continue working, mindful of her own age and wanting to continue serving the people as long as she could. Christmas and New Year's celebrations were very muted without Philip. She had to cancel some engagements because her own health began deteriorating. And this is a matter of some serious concern even today, because she has had COVID now. She also has had to cancel more of her appearances than usual, so she is in a decline. Even in spite of all this past December, she refused to cancel her annual Christmas Day address. And for the first time, it was more personal than any of hers had been. Christmas Day 2021, the Queen spoke to her people. Although it's a time of great happiness and good cheer for many, Christmas can be hard for those who have lost loved ones. This year especially, I understand why. But for me, in the months since the death of my beloved Philip, I have drawn great comfort from the warmth and affection of the many tributes to his life and work from around the country, the Commonwealth, and the world. His sense of service, intellectual curiosity, and capacity to squeeze fun out of any situation were all irrepressible. That mischievous, inquiring twinkle was as bright at the end as when I first set eyes on him. With the new year, Platinum Jubilee celebrations now start going as such. February, which is the month that she actually passes the 70-year mark, and she becomes, in February, the first British monarch in history to celebrate a Platinum Jubilee. She's the longest-serving female monarch. If she survives, she will survive Louis XIV, the Sun King, in less than 3 years from now. That would make her the longest-serving monarch in history. She is the oldest reigning queen ever, and that kind of milestone puts Elizabeth in some pretty rare company. On February 6, 2022, Queen Elizabeth's Platinum Jubilee began with a day of remembrance honoring her own father, King George VI. She spent the anniversary of her father's death and the beginning of her Jubilee at Sandringham in Norfolk, where her father had died. She stayed at Wood Farm, which was the place that Prince Philip had stayed after his retirement from formal duties. You know, with any party, and this is a huge party, in June, all of Britain is going to revel in the happiness of this monarch's, this beloved Queen's Jubilee. There are all manner of things being planned, and as you might expect, all manner of things being offered for sale to commemorate this once-in-a-lifetime achievement. This is the official commemorative coin which has been struck, and interestingly, it shows Elizabeth on horseback. This is so appropriate for her, again, for a nod to her love of horses. And this is called a comport. It's basically a cake stand, but it also is an official commemorative piece that's offered for sale. They had over 10,800 cups and plates, we would call them cups and saucers, made to honor the occasion. However, not even a queen can avoid the occasional typo. It celebrates the Platinum Jubilee instead of Jubilee. Those 10,800 cups and saucers are on sale at a reduced price. This is her official Platinum Jubilee portrait, marking her 70 years on the throne. You know, she's something. She's something for so many different reasons. And I commend to you again the book, The Queen, by Matthew Dennison, because he has taken an incredibly complicated life that moved through decades of important, significant world history, and has shown how she carefully and methodically kept the course to do service to her people for her entire lifetime. He shows us glimpses of the humor. He shows us glimpses of the backbone that she had to have. And he shows us glimpses, perhaps too many, of the sorrows that she's felt with the losses in her life. Losses that were not always death, but losses of children because of behaviors that were just not acceptable, whether you were royal or common. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope that you will read the book. It's well worth your time, and it's a really fine look at a very important person that we're all living at the same time. Thank you.